Really?
Wow. Dang. Metroid Dread is really not messing around with its puzzles. Metroid Dread opens with a prologue recapping Metroid Fusion and establishing the story of Dread. Now, for the sake of avoiding spoilers, I'm just going to say that this opening cutscene efficiently informs the players on what brought Samus to this point in her story and gets the ball rolling for the events of Dread. Honestly, I was surprised that this game is a direct sequel to Fusion. Since it had been so much time since Fusion came out, I guess I assumed that Nintendo didn't want to continue that story. I know Fusion is a somewhat divisive game, but not so divisive that Nintendo would want to steer clear of the story developments that it introduced. So simply because it had been nearly 19 years since the release of Fusion, maybe Nintendo was done with that part of Samus' story. But here we have it, Metroid 5, finally. I don't know what took them so long to make this game, but later is better than never, I suppose. And watching this opening prologue brought many great memories back of not only Metroid Fusion, but the entire Metroid series. The worst thing I'll say about this prologue is that it's unskippable. I have a special disdain for unskippable cutscenes in video games, and in this day and age, it can be shocking to find them when you'd think that developers would have learned by now that they are a cardinal sin. Maybe I'm petty, but not being able to skip the prologue makes me hesitate to start another playthrough of this game. It's a strange issue this game has because after the beginning of the game, every preceding cutscene is skippable, which is why I'm so perplexed that the opening one is not. And it's the longest cutscene in the entire game. But thankfully, after you're given control of Samus, you can skip all remaining cutscenes, letting the gameplay flow smoothly from this point on, with the exception of some tutorial moments, but those are brief and very few. One thing you'll notice as soon as you start playing Metroid Dread is how well the game controls. Samus is very snappy and quite agile compared to her iterations in Super Metroid and the Prime games. She can pull herself up on ledges, wall jump with ease, has plenty of mid-air control, can start and stop on a dime, has a great new slide move, and can run very fast. This is Samus's base moveset. When I first played this game, seeing how great it was to control Samus really excited me for obtaining power-ups later on in the game because I knew many of them would only increase Samus's mobility and make traversal feel painless and rewarding. I couldn't wait to play with classic abilities such as the speed booster, the space jump / screw attack, and the grapple beam. And then I would be pleasantly surprised by some series firsts like the flash shift and the cross bomb. Even the counter mechanic was greatly improved upon in Dread. It's now a much more fluent ability and doesn't interrupt the flow of gameplay like it did in Samus Returns for the 3DS. That was a decent game, which introduced many concepts that I have mixed feelings on, but the biggest mechanic that I had contention with was easily the counter mechanic. Countering in that game usually meant running into an enemy, stopping, waiting for the tell, countering, then firing to kill the enemy. It was such a pace killer for me that it greatly diminished my willingness to explore. Enemies were mostly a nuisance that meant I had to stop what I was doing to dispatch them. But in Dread, it's been greatly improved. You can now counter while moving and counter in the air, which is all the mechanic needed to be a worthwhile addition in the game. It makes killing enemies much better, and some enemies are placed in environments in ways where countering them while running or jumping is required, meaning Dread tests you on the mastery of this mechanic far more than Samus Returns ever did. In almost every way, controlling Samus in Dread feels like the best it has been in the whole series. But there is one exception. Analog control just isn't ideal for a 2D game. Controlling Samus with the analog stick is probably the one thing that keeps her control from being flawless for me. For the most part, it's fine, but there are too many instances where you'll mean to point Samus's arm cannon straight ahead, but you'll actually be aiming too far up or down. Or while clinging to a ledge, you'll intend to jump away from it, but the stick will be pushed just ever so slightly up, and Samus will climb onto the ledge instead. It's rare that these instances will get you in any sort of trouble, but it can be frustrating when your character does something you didn't intend, even if it's your fault. And I can't think of a good solution to this problem. Analog control means that you're able to plant Samus in one spot and have a full 360 range of where she aims, which is a great inclusion and gets you a lot of precision when aiming. But movement in a 2D space is just flat out better with the D-pad. There's no getting around that fact. In a great video on Dread from the YouTube channel Narrel, he details how he emulated Samus Returns and tried to set the controls to having movement be controlled with the D-pad and 360 aiming be controlled with the analog stick. And he concluded that it felt very clumsy and fatiguing to switch back and forth between the stick stick and the pad. He said that maybe 360 aiming could be controlled with the gyro, but I have some reservations on how well gyro aiming would work in a 2D game, but he might be right. I wouldn't know unless I tried it out for myself. I said in the beginning that after the opening, the game flows well. I didn't just mean that the control was fluent, but the game is very well paced. I know that pacing is a hard thing to quantify. It's something that has to be felt by playing the game yourself and can't quite be objectively described. But I felt that the power-ups and upgrades were dealt out at just the right pace to keep a constant feeling of progression and power. It always feels like I have just the right amount of missiles and health to deal with the bosses and enemies throughout the game. Progressing through the game and snagging missile and health upgrades as I came across them made it so I never felt too weak or too powerful for what the game was throwing at me at any given point. And just as one power-up was starting to get stale, I'd obtain another one that was usually fun to play with and spiced up the way I'd interact with the enemies and the world of the game. When I casually play through the game and don't go out of my way to obtain 100% of the collectibles, I'd guess that I reach the final boss with about 45% completion, and that honestly feels about right to me. It gives me just enough missiles where I can take him down, but there's a level of tension that makes me not want to miss any of my shots. Sure, that depends on a person's skill level, but this balance worked well for me. Where the balance breaks a little is in the 100% run. In a game like Metroid, getting 100% of all of the collectibles means waiting until right before you kill the final boss to comb through the world one last time to get everything you weren't able to get because you didn't have all the power-ups required. Remember that 45% figure I said a minute ago? Remember how I said the percentage was just right to beat the game with relative ease? Well, that means that more than half of the collectibles are preparing you for a challenge that just isn't there. You'll have twice the number of missiles you'll need, several health tanks that you'll never have to tap into, and way more power bombs than you could possibly use. It's ridiculous. I doubt I ever needed more than 3 power bombs before finding drops for them, yet you can expand your arsenal to have up to 15. It's already hard enough to incentivize players to get 100% in these games because of how much it kills the pace, but when you add the fact that more than half of those upgrades aren't even necessary, it really cheapens the value of them. But all that being said, the saving grace of the 100% run is that most of the collectibles are gated behind very challenging and satisfying tests to obtain them. While many of the upgrades are just placed in plain sight, some of the puzzles you're required to solve take a lot of thought and skill to complete. Even after more than a dozen playthroughs of this game, it's hard for me to get all of the collectibles. Still, what would make it a lot better for me is if they were necessary to beat the game. I'd also like it if they centered more of the challenges around other abilities than the speed booster. You're required to show some real mastery of the speed booster and shine sparking, but I don't feel like any of the other abilities were stretched to the same limits as the speed booster. I get that the speed booster is probably just the most versatile ability and therefore easier to design challenges for, but there's wasted potential in other abilities. Like, at no point did the game ask you to do any tricky space jump puzzles, and it easily could have. You could have been forced to space jump through tight corridors with enemies and hazards on the ceilings and floors to make you space jump in the right sweet spot. I know that's not a very creative use of the ability, but the game doesn't showcase any complex instances of space jumping even on that level. From what I can remember, the closest the game ever comes to challenging you in that way is this moment right here, where you have to time your double jump just right to maneuver around these obstacles in such a way to make your jump. More of this would have gone a long way for me. Another issue I have is that I cannot tell the different areas from one another. Every room may be distinct enough from the rest of the game, but I couldn't tell you which room is from which area. This isn't the biggest problem that I have because the game does a good enough job with its guidance that I never get lost, but it'd still be very nice to be able to take one look at a room in this game and be able to say which area of the game it is in. Take a look at Super Metroid. You would never mistake a room in Norfair with a room in Criteria or the wrecked ship. That's always extremely useful when trying to navigate these games as large maps. And because of that, even after more than a dozen playthroughs of this game, I still can't remember the area names by memory like I could in Super Metroid after just one playthrough. I somewhat admire the consistent aesthetic this game has from one area to the next. It helps the game maintain a consistent flow in its world design, but it'd be nice if they found ways to make the individual areas feel more distinct. Nevertheless, I still think that this game looks really great. I love the art design and how nice the 3D graphics look, and the fact that the game runs really consistently at 60 frames a second is a godsend. It's not rock solid though. There are some frame dips when the action gets really crazy on screen, but it's never bad enough to hamper your performance. Maybe next to Breath of the Wild, this is my favorite looking game on the Switch and one of the best looking games I've seen in years. It's just yet more proof that a great looking game comes not from high fidelity graphics, but from good art direction. This game having 3D graphics also gives us some wonderfully composed cinematic moments too. There are so many moments when the camera will pull in or out to frame the action from really great angles. Sometimes it's just a slide Samus does, or the final blow on a boss, or even just running through hallways. But this game is constantly using its visual style and graphics to emphasize the right moments at the right time. Being so used to 2D graphics for this series and for Metroidvanias entirely, I was curious how the 3D graphics would turn out here, especially since Samus Returns didn't look so great. That could just be because of the hardware though, but Dread looks fantastic. The backgrounds have loads of depth, and there are always new things I find moving around each time I play this game. Metroid is a series that has to visually impress. The series has a great record of amazing visuals, and this game is no exception. And again, shoutouts to the high frame rate, because this is also one of the toughest Metroid games ever made. If the game slogged at 30 or below, that really would have hindered the experience, because every enemy is going to test your reaction time, and I mean every enemy, from the basic little creatures to the boss fights. Sometimes your windows to react would be so tight that it would almost feel unfair to dip below 60 FPS. Speaking to Dread's difficulty, I think I saw the game overscreen in this Metroid title more than any other entry in the series. Nearly every enemy will test your abilities to parry and will punish you for messing it up. Bosses will push the parry mechanic to its limit. It gets to the point where successfully countering a boss feels amazing, especially in the final fight. I think that the game's high difficulty is a key pillar to what makes it so successful. I think that the main appeal of Metroid is how immersive the games can be, and since this game gives you so much mobility, it better have tough enemies to match. Otherwise, you won't get that great feeling of being lost and alone on a hostile alien planet. When games have difficulty modes, typically the normal mode is what the developers are expecting most players to play on. I imagine that games are balanced around normal mode, but ideally when a player has reached the skill ceiling of a game, the hard mode is what they'll feel most comfortable playing on. Hard mode should test the player on their mastery of a game's systems and mechanics, and that's why I found Dread's hard mode to be very disappointing. I think that the hard mode in this game offers a mostly similar experience to the normal mode. As far as I can tell, no enemies are swapped out for different ones, and the existing enemies are not given newer or more challenging movesets. It's just number tweaking. Enemies have more health and deal more damage. That's it. Which could be sufficient enough to offer a harder and more tense playthrough, but since enemies can still be one-shot after a successful counter, a hard mode playthrough will nearly be identical to a normal mode playthrough. Where the differences between the two modes shows the most clearly would be in the boss fights. Like I said before, movesets are seemingly the same between normal and hard difficulty, so the differences in boss fights are just that the bosses hit a lot harder. You'll be using the same tactics to kill them, but your mistake allowance won't be as forgiving. Because of all of that, I really found the hard mode to be a disappointing affair in Dread. But I'd still say it's the ideal way to play the game, but don't expect it to be a noticeably different experience from the normal mode. Man, I remember playing through Fusion when I was a kid. To this day, it's still one of my most beloved gaming experiences I've ever had. I'll never forget that moment when you see the SAX for the first time. It's genuinely terrifying and still gives me chills. Dread's version of the SAX is the Emmy. Emmy stands for Extraplanetary Multiform Mobile Identifier. They're Federation robots that crawl like spiders, hunt Samus down, and can swiftly kill her in a single strike. I really like the Emmy. There are 7 of them that you face through the course of the game, and each one is slightly different from the last. Each major area has one of these, and you'll have to deal with most of them several times before you're given the means to kill them. Sometimes you'll have to trudge through water to get away, sometimes you'll have to deal with one that has super speed, some can see you through walls, and all can kill you very easily. I still have many close calls with these things even after completing the game so many times. They can't recreate the terror of the SAX perfectly though. In Fusion, you could never know when the SAX would show up, and you'd go so long without encountering it that you'd almost forget about it until it would pop up and scare the shit out of you. The Emmy don't quite reach those heights. You're told how many of them there are in the beginning of the game, and you enter the Emmy section through these special doors, so you know when and where you'd encounter them. Because of their aggression and you only have 2 attempts to counter if you're grabbed by one, I'd say that they have more mechanical depth than the SAX did, but the SAX turned Fusion into a horror game, and helped bolster the narrative in ways that the Emmy failed to do. Also, I think that some of the times they grab you is utter bullshit, but overall, I really like them. And when one has been giving you a lot of trouble, it's pretty satisfying to get the special beam that you can use to blow their heads off. I think that Metroid Dread is the first really great Metroid game since Prime 2. I don't know if it came across in this video or not, but I'm not a very big fan of Samus Returns. I think it's a fine game, but it's one I often remember for its horrible pacing and clunky controls. And when I read that Mercury Steam, the developers who made Samus Returns, would be making Dread, I didn't have high hopes. But Mercury Steam really ironed out Samus Returns' kinks, and as a result, Dread is an extremely polished Metroid game that I love to replay over and over again. Metroid has come and gone over the decades. It has innovated game design arguably more than any other franchise has. Super Metroid refined the Metroid formula and has a whole genre of games inspired and named after it. Metroid Prime defined how Metroidvanias would work in a 3D space. It's a franchise whose influence is immeasurable. Sadly, for the last decade and a half, Metroid fans have had to get their Metroid fix in other games like Hollow Knight and Environmental Station Alpha, and who knows how long it'll be until we get another true Metroid game like Dread. But I think that Dread shows that the Metroid series still has a lot to offer and hasn't been totally dethroned by the really great games that other developers had been making in the genre. Hey Robert Forrester, what do you think of the Metroid games?
They're pretty good.